Hello, everyone. This is John Cox, president of Cape Cod Community College. Good day. As we gather to reflect on the life and commitment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy, I want to share his writing from 1947 contained in the Maroon Tiger, the Morehouse College student newspaper. As we listen to this, recall this is the voice of an 18-year-old Morehouse man growing up in a segregated Atlanta. An 18-year-old's wisdom, a teenager, on life entitled The Purpose of Education. Think about this in the context of the world of 2022. The young king observed, as I engage in the so-called bull sessions around and about the school, I too often find that most college students have a misconception of the purpose of education. Most of the brethren think that education should equip them with the proper instruments of exploitation so that they can forever trample over the masses. Still others think that education should furnish them with noble ends rather than means to an end. Undergraduate Martin Luther King continued, it seems to me that education has a twofold function to perform in the life of each of us and in society. The one is utility and the other is culture. Utility and culture. Education must enable each student to become more efficient, to achieve with increasing facility the legitimate goals of life. Education must also train one for quick, resolute, and effective thinking. To think incisively and to think for oneself is very difficult. We are prone to let our mental life become invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and propaganda. King continued on in his narrative. At this point, I often wonder whether or not education is fulfilling its purpose. A great majority of the so-called educated people do not think logically and scientifically. Even the press, the classroom, the platform, and the pulpit, in many instances, do not give us objective and unbiased truths. To save us from the morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education. Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. Martin Luther King concludes, the function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. But education which stops with efficiency may not prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the person gifted with reason, but with no morals. We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. Intelligence plus character. The complete education gives one not only power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. The broad education will therefore transmit to one not only the accumulated knowledge of the race, but also the accumulated experience of social living. If we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers. Unquote. So as we recall these words from a teenager, a Morehouse man in 1947, and the century before, and Dr. King's recognition in 1963 that we have a dream, we ask ourselves today, are we closer to achieving that dream? Thanks for joining us today.
Greetings to the family, friends, and community members of Cape Cod Community College. A warm thank you goes out to President John Cox. This program couldn't and wouldn't happen without you. Greetings to all of you watching this program who are located much further away from the Cape. My name is Asher Hamilton, and I'm the coordinator of student engagement at Cape Cod Community College. In this critical time of social distancing and uncertainty, your safety is our first priority. And to that end, this program will be pre-recorded and hosted on our 4Cs channel for your on-demand consumption. Please feel free to share this recording with your family, friends, and coworkers, or anyone who may share your interest. This program is a special celebration to the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass and many others have worked tirelessly to elevate the voices of our BIPOC community. Today, we will discuss how both men worked tirelessly to elevate the voices of our BIPOC community and all communities. Our virtual program will include a memorable guest presentation by Dr. Moise St. Louis of UMass Dartmouth, and a reading of a few memorable poems providing context and framework to this program. Dr. Moise St. Louis, PhD, is an interim associate vice chancellor for student affairs and an assistant dean and the director of the Frederick Douglass Intercultural Center at the University of Dartmouth, Massachusetts. He teaches political science, international relations, Caribbean and Latin American governments and politics, race and racial politics in America, race and racial politics in the Caribbean and Latin America, and peace and justice. He has taught both nationally and internationally, has published various titles and opinion pieces and poems. He is currently working on a book on the state formation and political legitimacy. He holds a PhD in comparative politics, international relations, and an MA in comparative politics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He also holds 3 BAs in political science, Afro-American studies, and the social thought and political economy. Wow. He is fluent in 4 languages. Most importantly, if you ask Dr. St. Louis, he will tell you that working in student affairs is his passion because he has the opportunity to support students and to directly impact their lives. His pronouns are he and his. When he isn't taking on the many roles with UMass Dartmouth, he is carving a place to make space for equity and inclusion for students and the community. He is the recipient of many community service awards and is a highly sought after public keynote speaker. He works tirelessly to fulfill the vision of MLK, which is liberty for everyone, while not ignoring the inequities and barriers that are impediments to millions and millions of Americans, some of which are BIPOC. Now, before we welcome Dr. St. Louis, I want to share this poem from Langston Hughes, I Too. I too. I too sing America. I am the darker sister. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and I eat well and I grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at that table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am American. Now I'd like to invite Dr. St. Louis to share with us some wonderful words that I think we should take a moment to listen to.
Good morning. Good morning. Let me first pay respect to the ancestors and my First Nation brothers and sisters on whose land we are on. May they hold us accountable. My deepest respect to the President, Dr. John Cox, his cabinet, the faculty and staff, and members of the community at large. Institutions like this one are not insular, but serve the greater community. My sincere appreciation to Ms. Asha Hamilton. It is always a pleasure to meet someone so committed to student success and equity. You know, our institutions are connected as many of your students continue their education at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And so, frankly, it's a real pleasure to share a few thoughts with you as neighbors. I seldom accept the invitation to speak in MLK celebration. I find them too often to be an empty celebration of peace and unity, a hollow remembrance of the man who valued justice so much that he would be killed advocating for it. Too often, our commitment to justice and equity remains rhetorical and not praxis. And so I ask you not to see this as a celebration of Dr. King's life, but as an opportunity to recommit ourselves to the values for which he died. And to hold you to that recommitment, I ask you to spend some time throughout the coming year to identify and reflect on structured injustices that shape institutional processes, policies, and support services, and to think about ways to circumvent and change them so that your institution can fulfill its life-transforming mission for the students you serve to its fullest. I cannot think of a better way to honor Dr. King than to look at institutions, their policies and practices that far too often, as you know, are enshrined in systems of inequality that leads to disparate treatments, access, and impact. I accepted this invitation because we are living in perilous times, my friends. And whatever one can do to focus and uplift the human spirit, one should. We are living in a time of fear, hate, and uncertainty with a pandemic tormenting us. A time where declining trust in our institutions and each other have undermined our capacity to find comprehensive solutions, not just to this pandemic, but solutions to the systemic challenges facing our society. This is a time that requires critical inquiry, reflection, and love. To understand the challenges we are facing, I want to call upon your historical memory. To paraphrase an apt observer, if we don't know where we have been, we will neither fully understand where we are, what we are facing, nor determine what we must do to overcome and what directions we should take. We cannot know the source of our suffering, nor remedies to it, if we cannot identify a sickness. You know, my late mother often said that there is no greater sickness than the sickness of the soul. We find ourselves facing a sickness of the body and the soul. A sickness that affects both the soul of our nation, by extension, ours. A sickness of the body that brings in full view the dehumanization process that allows a man to put his knee on another man's neck undisturbed, to denigrate the immigrant and the poor, to shoot Black and brown kinfolks at will without provocation, to systematically, in plain view, for the sake of political power, we institute Jim Crow-like limits on the right of fellow citizens to vote and participate in the democratic process. My friends, we find ourselves at a perilous time undermining our very democratic foundation instead of enhancing it and securing it. In this age of fear, resentment, and pandemic, we are faced with a sickness that makes the discomfort of the individual more important than the lives and welfare of others in the community. Yes, friends, and we cannot wash our hands of it, for we are complicit for both what we have done and what we could have done, what we have said or could have said. We are facing a historical moment, brought about by our continued failure to address our society's moral questions. History, it seems, keeps repeating itself over and over again. The psychologist and anti-colonial scholar Frantz Fanon once warned that history not learned and understood will be repeated and re-experienced. The historical moral questions were asked by Frederick Douglass many moons ago, a few years before the Civil War broke out. What does the Declaration of Independence or claim to freedom and our nation's principles of equality amongst all men and justice for all mean to those who experience neither equality nor justice? What does it mean in the case of Black Americans and Native Americans? What did it mean in the face of their continued enslavement by the very people claiming democracy and equality for all? Douglass asked. Douglass called on fellow Americans to ensure that the country remained true to its ideals. Douglass' call to conscience could have led to a revaluation of the nation, its institutions, and its practices. His questions could have made his fellow citizens uncomfortable enough to make America's freedom true for all. They did not heed his call. Instead, they consolidated and institutionalized the injustices and inconsistencies, their comfort with inequality, moral inconsistency, and the suffering of others created a divided nation, led to a civil war, and killed 750,000 citizens, about 504 people a day. These deaths did not cause deep reflection, but for a second. The act of the Emancipation Declaration and the 13th Amendment were barely dried. Efforts at reconstruction barely began before those uncomfortable with equality ushered in to state-sanctioned violence and the law, 100 years of Jim Crow, convict leasing, that the author David Blockman called slavery by another name, lynching and separate body rule. We failed the moral test then White moderates remain silent, enjoy the fruits of the violence, not uncomfortable enough at the suffering of their Black and brown fellow citizens. The civil rights movement led by Dr. King was an attempt to address this moral failing. Dr. King would observe in his canonic letter from Birmingham jail that it was not those who hated that were barriers to freedom, but those who did not hate but did not act to upend that 100 years of suffering. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block in the struggle towards freedom is not the White Citizen Council or the Ku Klux Klan, King wrote, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill, King concluded, is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance, much more bewildering than outright rejection. Unquote. The king that we today celebrate was from a middle-class family, had his PhD at 26, and the Nobel Peace Prize at 35. He was the pastor of what would be considered now a megachurch. He could have lived out his life relatively at ease, but unlike white moderates, he was uncomfortable with inequality and injustice. His morality compelled him not just to speak out his disaccord and raise his voice against the suffering of fellow human beings, but to act against their suffering. King's discomfort triggered his conscience. He sacrificed the comfort of a life of economic ease to the discomfort of the struggle for justice and equality. For King, injustice needed to be exposed to the light of human conscience for it to be cured. If oppression makes wise men mad, as Douglas wrote, King believed that it diminished our humanity. In other words, King understood that the cost to both the body and the soul was too great for those who benefit from oppression and see oppression and do nothing to stop it, as well as for those who are its target. King understood that one could not devalue and dehumanize another human being without devaluing and diminishing one's own humanity, without degrading one's own conscience and human sensibilities. King offered moral courage and moral action as a path towards humanization. A society that dehumanizes some to the benefit of others cannot be free nor stable. It is a society destined for perpetual conflicts. More importantly, a society structured in oppression and marginalization, where everyday trauma, hurt, and heartaches are the norm, cannot be a healthy society. We see it in the level of anxiety of our kids, the anger unexplained, the widespread school shootings of the future of our nations or youth. We see it in the fear, the distrust, and the everyday violence that renders us numb when we should be outraged. We saw and felt it then as a society as clearly as we are seeing it now. Yet, as the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement did not usher permanent peace, but brought about the Southern strategy for political expediency. It brought redlining, housing and employment discrimination, occupation-style policing, restrictive laws, 3 strikes you're out, demonization, criminalization, police violence, and mass incarceration to Black and brown citizens. Those uncomfortable with justice, equal rights, and fairness, those who wanted neither equality nor equity, who preferred power over justice, domination over peace, sought new ways to discriminate, to devalue, to target, to undermine, and to dehumanize. King understood that. He understood that war on others meant poverty at home, and domination meant instability. He understood that freedom without security and the means to pursue one's happiness was hollow. His Poor People's Campaign, his anti-war stance brought him not love, but displeasure, and ultimately death. Can we celebrate King then without first accounting for the things he fought and died for? Without accounting for the inequality in our society, in our institutions, in our businesses, and in our homes? Can we truly honor King without answering our society's moral questions? What does it mean to celebrate King in the face of existing discrimination, mistreatments, police violence, discriminatory voting laws and practices, and economic and social inequality? To honor King, we must become comfortable with being uncomfortable. We must center morality in our comfort. We must act. The question raised by Douglas and King remain the central moral questions of today. They are still the questions we must answer to permanently solve our nation's crisis. You know, I often tell my students, if they're not uncomfortable, they're not paying attention. Today, I invite you into the discomfort so we can move forward together. I invite you to explore the uncomfortableness of both Frederick Douglass and Dr. King. Douglass at the eve of the Fugitive Slave Act before the American Civil War, and King at the closing of the American Civil Rights Movement, before the advent of the Southern strategy and mass incarceration. I invite you to engage in an exploration of your soul, of your own moral core. Every human being, every American citizen, and every generation has an opportunity to answer the moral questions Douglass and King posed. They can choose to hold the nation and society to its principles or betray those principles. This is our time, my friends. With the specter of violence, the resurgence of white terror and xenophobia, the terrorizing of Black lives, the reemergence of Jim Crow laws, and attempts to restrict the right to vote across the nation, what will you do to honor Dr. King? King's statement that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people, still rings true more than 50 years later. King was talking to all of us. We cannot continue the silence of the past lest we be caught in the circularity of history, not learned. To answer Douglass and King's questions, we cannot be silenced. We cannot be silent moderns. Our voices are needed in our actions for a better future. As educators and staff at a higher ed institution, we have a unique opportunity to actualize King's dream. We can use our privileged positions to help usher freedom and equity by supporting the demands of the oppressed, even when we fear losing our privileges. Ours must be a morally grounded position, lest we leave the mess our parents left us to our children. We have choices to make. Those of us with the privilege of education must create access points. We must create access points so students can be empowered and their lives can be transformed. The services we provide do not just reflect the expectations of the job and the expectations of the positions we hold. They must be guided by the morality teased by our conscience. Many of you who now hold these positions of privilege do not marginalize because of your color, may have been the first in your family to attend college or to have access to a decent and reliable job. You are in a position to empathize and humanize. If your current privilege has not blinded you, you understand the marginalization low-income working class people face daily. You have the power to provide your students with the support to open their marginalization through their education. You have the power to provide your colleagues with an environment of collegiality and support to create a truly inclusive and supportive community. If you are listening to this presentation and you are white and privileged, with privileges come responsibilities, moral responsibilities. If you are white and marginalized for whatever reason, whether because you are low income, LGBTQ plus, differently abled, or a trauma survivor, though your whiteness may offer you some protection, your life has taught you the challenges of marginalization. You have the possibility of finding common cause with the most marginalized rather than compete for a position of privileged marginalization. If you are BIPOC, educated, and economically privileged, you too have a responsibility to ensure that the limited protection your position affords does not shield you from your responsibility to your brethren. If you are a student listening, this is your world. It is your world to shape. It is your future to mold. You cannot remain silent or passive. Your engagement, your participation, and your voice matter. If you feel there is no place for you, make the place you need so that you and those who will come after you will have a place where they feel they belong. You cannot wait for somebody to make a space for you. You have to claim your space. If you are BIPOC and or economically, socially, and politically disenfranchised, lift up your head so the privileged can look you in the eye. Hold their gaze so they may understand that their privilege is the cause of your marginalization. So your humanity can trigger their conscience and sense of justice and fairness. The survival of generations depends on your survival and your success. as your survival has had much to do with the survival of the ancestors, despite the trauma, the daily slights, and the terror. You too have a responsibility to yourself and future generations to persevere, to survive, and to succeed despite the barriers and the disadvantages. You have no other options. The kids are watching you, and how you persist will tell them whether to give up and give in or push forward regardless of the obstacles. Friends, we have a responsibility, all of us, to make our society better than we found it. Yes, even better than we experienced it. More importantly, we are in a unique position to improve the lives of those around us. We can help someone in our classrooms and offices succeed, help them feel valued and supported by what we choose to do, by how we engage, what thoughtfulness and compassion we show. The students in our midst, our colleagues, we can create the kind of edifying environment and world that humanizes us all. Too often, our willingness to close our eyes to preserve our privilege, personal ease, or comfort means that we allow others to be dehumanized, to feel devalued. We cannot be fully human when people around us are not treated as fully human, deserving of compassion, protection, support, and love. Frederick Douglass and King understood that. Their call to conscience, their call so many years ago, is still the call of the day. If we are to honor King, I invite you to honor him with deeds, everyday deeds. These deeds, he believed, as I do, will lead to our liberation, all of us. And so to conclude, I want to remind you of my request of reevaluation of your institution, its processes, its policies, to ensure that all within its door are fully supported and uplifted. Let us commit ourselves to King's message, not rhetorically, but substantively, so that when you meet again next year, it can be in true celebration of having walked King's path, of having made his message a lived experience for your students, colleagues, and members of your community. Thank you.
Dr. St-Louis, I can't say enough. Obviously, there has been clear and evident preparation in this. The words, I can't say enough. The words hit me. I need to take a moment. I think our audience will probably need to take a moment just to breathe this in. Something that I heard you say, and something that I've often said myself: make space in order to take space. I often say also, truth to power. And that's definitely what I've heard this evening. Truth to power. What also resonates is lukewarm acceptance, moral neglect, and moral consciousness. So a few questions that I have and that our audience has for you, I'm going to ask. I'm going to start with the first question. In your speech, you ask our community to reflect on how they would build a better community for our students. and each other as colleagues. Why do you feel that this is so important?
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton, for the question. I think it is easier to externalize, to look somewhere for solutions than to look where one sits and practice what one believes. And for me, it's an exercise, right? It's an opportunity of practicing one's moral values, right? And actualizing them. And I think if we do that, right? If we think about how we engage with each other daily, if we think about how we support our students, how we listen to them, how we don't listen to them, how we support them and how we don't support them. And if we are thoughtful about that and reflective about that, we have an opportunity to really actualize King's dream, to really create the beloved community, right? We don't have to dream it, we can live it, we can actualize it, right? King didn't want to dream indefinitely. He was dreaming because he knew that wasn't possible at the time he was making the speech. And we are too keen on thinking about the dream, but what King was asking is for his kids to be able to live those dreams, right? And so we have an opportunity to actually create the space for the dream to be lived and for the dream to be experienced. And we should take it. And I think we'll all be the better for it.
Thank you for that. I have another question. It may be a difficult one, but often we talk about Black Lives Matter and we contrast that with other lives. And I'd like to ask this question. You seem to link the Black struggle through time. Your presentation is from Douglass and King to Black Lives Matter. Can you talk about why you see continuity? How would you define Black Lives Matter in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the dream of Dr. King?
Thank you for these questions. I'm a political scientist by training and a historian at heart. But I think it doesn't require a political scientist and a historian to understand that the struggle of Black Americans have been the struggle for the moral foundation of the country. And to really, we can really trace that struggle historically. And that will tell you the very history of our country. And I think it really it's really interesting to think about lynching rhetorically and to see lynching in plain sight. And I think to think about lynching as a depraved indifference to someone else's life, right? To not really value the human being enough to not cause terror upon them. And if you trace Douglass's speech, Douglass was talking about terror. He was talking about white terror and the failings of the nation to live to its ideal. And the restructuring of inequality in the nation amidst the claim of liberty. If you listen to King carefully, King was calling to the conscience of the average citizen to stop the depravity and to think about what does it mean to be a good human being if your brother is suffering, but really to sensitize those who had experienced moral failing and the numbness of recognizing the value of Black life, to sensitize them to the humanity of Black people. right? And King was pretty intentional about that because he believed that seeing the suffering will trigger the conscience. It was a risk because King understood that lynching was suffering, but King also understood that there is a possibility for the human being to recognize itself to someone else's eyes. And so King pursued Douglas's theme of awakened conscience, right? Of calling us to a moral grounding or moral ethics. And I think the current times we're living, especially within when you think about the Black Lives Matter, it really synthesizes both King and Douglas in a really simple slogan, right? That which they have been fighting for was the lack of recognition of the value of Black lives. And that which African American and Black and brown people had been experiencing since the Civil Rights Movement was the targeting and the devaluing of Black lives. And so their affirmation, right? It's an affirming slogan that Black lives, in spite of the terror, in spite of the criminalization, in spite of the discrimination, of the mass incarceration, in spite of the demonization, in spite of the terror, matters. Matters, right? And so it makes people feel uncomfortable. And it makes people feel uncomfortable precisely because the message rings so true. And it triggers people's conscience because they know it's not a lived experience of the nation. And so I think in many ways, the Black Lives Matter struggle brings to bear in a simple slogan what Douglas and King and the overall Afro-American struggle has been. But what's more important, what the death of George Floyd make us realize, because we can hide behind not knowing in order to quiet our conscience. And the death of the murder, the terrorizing of George Floyd was palpable, undeniable, his dehumanization visible and inescapable. And that, I think for many of us, regardless of where we stood, regardless of our color and our position, created a moral crisis for us. How could we live in a society where we can witness such depravity, such terror, and such dehumanization?
Thank you so much. I really think that encapsulates a lot of what you've said to us through your presentation, through the work that you have lived, through everything that you are. It sounds like, in spite of all that has happened to our BIPOC community, we shall overcome. We have survived. Thank you, Dr. St. Louis. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for presenting. Thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for being transparent. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being you.
Thank you for the invitation and my big thanks to the community. I hope to visit you soon, and I hope we'll collaborate to better support our students.
And I'm going to hold you to that. Many of our students, especially our BIPOC students, are looking for the support that you would offer them. and we invite you. We all invite you. As we come to a close with this program, there's this poem that I believe that we've all recognized and heard before, a poem that really kind of summarizes what we've been talking about all along and sharing in the presentation and in this event. This is called The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. I'm not going to read the poem in its entirety because just what we are about to touch, I believe, is enough. I recommend that you go out, get access to this poem, read it all carefully, think about it, reflect, because there's something here that can be said when an African-American young woman can state that this is the hill that she climbs. Here goes. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. And the norms and notion of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a mother can dream of becoming president only to find herself reciting for one. And so it goes. We have overcome, but there's so much more left unfinished. I'd like to say to you, thank you for watching this, for allowing this presentation to resonate. As I said before, please share this recording. Please share it with friends, family, and those who are like-minded, even those who aren't, because there's something being said here. It's a cry for change. It's a cry to be heard, to witness what we all have witnessed. Thank you. My name is Asher Hamilton, and I am the Student Engagement Coordinator at 4Cs. Please look for more programming like this, especially in the month of February, known as Black History. Go on to our website, look at those programs, see which one of those programs speaks out to you. Maybe one, maybe two, maybe all. But more than anything, support us in our Black History programming and the work that we're doing here. Thank you so much.